a practice problem from the last video. How many oxygen molecules combine to one hemoglobin molecule? Hopefully you answered 4. That's the correct answer. And maybe you were thinking in your head, yep, they're going to bind using cooperative binding, and you'd be able to explain what that was. Let's try another question. At rest, the apex of the lungs receives the majority of blood flow. Hopefully you answered false. So the apex of the lungs is the top, the base of the lungs is the bottom. And because of gravity, at rest, the base of the lung is going to have a higher blood flow than the apex of the lung. Just like with oxygen, our carbon dioxide is relying on the blood for transport. But in this case, we're trying to transport it from the tissue that it was produced in and out into the air. Now, once that carbon dioxide is released from the cells, it's going to be carried in the blood in 3 different forms. It can be dissolved in the plasma, which only accounts for about 10% of the CO2. It can be bound to hemoglobin, which only accounts for about 20% of the CO2. And when it's bound to hemoglobin, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. Or it can be transported as bicarbonate. And this is by far and large the most common way that the CO2 is traveling through the blood as a form of bicarbonate, which accounts for about 70%. Let's talk a little bit more about that bicarbonate ion. Carbon dioxide and water molecules will combine to form carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. This reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, which is found in the red blood cells themselves. Carbonic acid is an unstable molecule and will quickly dissociate to form a free hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion, HCO3. The importance of the formation of the bicarbonate ion in the addition of the hydrogen ion is that hydrogen ion is going to bind to hemoglobin, and this is going to trigger the Bohr effect, which is going to shift the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve to the right. At the same time, the bicarbonate ion is diffusing out of the red blood cell and into the plasma, and chloride ions diffuse into the red blood cell so that you don't have a disturbance of the electrical balance of that cell. The actual formation of these hydrogen ions will enhance the unloading of oxygen at the level of the tissue. And the hemoglobin in this case is going to act as a buffer because it's going to bind those hydrogen ions and prevent any sort of significant changes in the acid of that fluid. And so we're going to talk more about acids and bases later on, but just to bring up, this is already one of those mechanisms that we're using to control the amount of hydrogen ions that are produced during exercise. Now, once we reach the blood in the lungs, because the partial pressure of CO2 is lower, the hydrogen ion and the bicarbonate ion will recombine, and they're going to form carbonic acid, which can then dissociate again into carbon dioxide and water, and you'll breathe that off as water vapor and carbon dioxide. This is a really nice schematic to review the content from the previous slide. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the transformation of those hydrogen ions and how they're being bound to form carbonic acid and being moved from the tissue where those hydrogen and CO2 molecules are being produced. On the right side, you'll see then how is that then going the opposite way within our equation to be released into the lungs so that we can breathe off that water and CO2. Make sure you can take the information from the previous slide and you can follow along appropriately looking on this slide. Pulmonary ventilation ends up being a very important tool for us when we're controlling our acid-base balance. It's through pulmonary ventilation that we're able to remove hydrogen ions from the blood by the HCO3 reaction that's shown below that we talked about on a previous slide. So when you're increasing your ventilation, so you're hyperventilating, you're breathing off CO2. And this is going to reduce the partial pressure of CO2 and hydrogen ions, so it's going to increase the pH. It will become more alkalytic in this case. Whereas if you have decreased ventilation, you'll have a buildup of CO2. This would increase the partial pressure of CO2 and hydrogen ions, and it would cause a decrease in pH, so you'd become more acidic in this case. One of the things we're always concerned with as exercise physiologists is that transition from rest to exercise. For pulmonary ventilation, we see that pulmonary ventilation increases very quickly when we go from rest to exercise, but it pretty quickly tapers off. We generally don't see too much of a change in our partial pressure of oxygen or partial pressure of CO2. If anything, we see the partial pressure of oxygen go down ever so slightly and a very small increase in our partial pressure of CO2. And what that tells us is there's a bit of a lag in our alveolar ventilation compared to our metabolism, meaning we're building up the byproduct of CO2 by undergoing anaerobic metabolism a little bit more quickly than we can then take in oxygen to be able to utilize aerobic metabolism. And that makes sense. We've talked about the oxygen deficit before and why that oxygen deficit occurs at the start of exercise. When someone does prolonged exercise in a hot and humid environment, we've already talked about how we see a bit of a drift in their heart rate. We call that the cardiovascular drift. But what's happening with their ventilation? We actually see the same thing. We see a bit of a drift in their ventilation. And that increase in blood and body temperature actually affects the pulmonary ventilation centers in the brain. And it's not actually due to a buildup of CO2 that we see these drifts or this increase in pulmonary ventilation in these environments of very hot and humid environments with prolonged exercise. So we've talked about the transition from rest to exercise as far as what's going to happen with ventilation. But what about when we look at increasing intensities of exercise? So to talk about this, we have to separate our untrained from our trained individuals because they're going to have different responses. In our untrained individuals, we're going to see a linear increase in ventilation as exercise intensity increases. But somewhere between 50% and 75% of that person's VO2 max, we're going to see an exponential rise in their ventilation. All of a sudden, they're going to start breathing very quickly and very deep breaths. We call that the ventilatory threshold. This makes sense because for this individual, they're likely hitting their lactate threshold somewhere in this range. And we see that the ventilatory threshold is actually very closely matched to the lactate threshold. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's happening to their PO2 values? Actually, their PO2 values are relatively stable from their resting values. They're only going to deviate maybe 10 to 12 millimeters of mercury, so you still have a pretty strong gradient there to move oxygen to the tissues. Now, some of the ventilatory changes that we see with an untrained individual would be what you might expect. However, with incremental exercise with elite athletes, we actually see some pretty interesting ventilatory responses. One, we see that the ventilatory threshold is going to occur at a higher percent of the VO2 max. And that makes perfect sense if we think about the fact that our ventilatory threshold is going to be very closely matched with our lactate threshold, which would also occur at a higher percentage of someone's VO2 max if they are highly trained. Now, what's really interesting is what's happening with the partial pressure of oxygen in our elite athletes with increasing workloads. What we notice is we see a decrease of 30 to 40 millimeters of mercury at or near maximal work. So what happens is when these very elite, highly trained individuals are exercising and they're at those very high intensities of exercise, which remember would be different than the absolute workload for you or I at a maximal intensity. These people are working at a much, much higher workload. They actually experience hypoxemia. And this hypoxemia occurs due to a ventilation perfusion mismatch, which we discussed when we talked about the apex and the base of the heart and its ventilation and perfusion ratio. So what happens is the red blood cells at those extremely high workloads for someone who's very highly trained have such a short transit time in the pulmonary capillaries because they have such a high cardiac output, right? Someone who's highly trained has a very large stroke volume, and so they're able to move very high volumes of blood through the pulmonary circulation, and it's just moving through so fast that it can't fully oxygenate as it passes through the lung capillaries.